Done. All right. So if you watch the attendee count, you'll see it going up
Hop on in there. Yeah, great.
slowly.
Now I see
but
two of
surely.
your videos. Is there a reason that there's two of you?
Yes, I am connecting as an attendee.
Oh, nice. You're getting our numbers up right there, Chris.
So I can make sure that everything's working correctly. So you're seeing, I'm surprised you're seeing two of me. That's not supposed to happen, but oh well.
That's right. Two different perspectives. It's gonna be a 2-on-1 battle right here.
Yeah. I hope one of them is the right perspective.
Yeah.
My good side. I may not have a good side, so
you got it. You're using it right now, so you're in a good spot.
The front side. Well, it's good to see you again, and I'm glad you agreed to do this. I think it's going to be interesting and fun.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. I always love spending time with the MSCI crowd, so should be great.
And you've been teaching in the program for how long now?
With all things COVID, you lose a sense of time.
I know.
But at least 2 or 3 different cadences and cohorts along the way.
Okay. So at least about 3 years, maybe
Correct.
maybe a little longer.
Yep.
Got it.
Exactly right. I gotta get my coffee to make sure that I don't bore myself here. So I've got the caffeine flowing.
Okay. There you go. All right, so I think it's time to start. We're at the top of the hour. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. It is on, I'm going to shorten it to the Cadence of Change, but it is with Dr. Peter Boumgarden from Washington University's Olin Business School. As you all know, I'm Chris Marty with MSCI. Just a quick couple of items. You've all probably heard this before, but you're all on mute, and that's by default. That's to keep our background noise during Peter's presentation and our Q&A sessions to a minimum. And on that note, to ask questions, please use the Q&A pane at the bottom of your Zoom window. And it would be nice if you would ask questions when you think of them. Don't wait until the end. We're going to have a couple of Q&A sessions during Peter's presentation. So please ask away right away, and we'll make sure we get answers to your questions. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Boumgarden. Peter is a professor of practice of strategy and organizations at Washington University's Olin Business School, and he is also the faculty director of what is called the Center for Experiential Learning at Olin. Peter, maybe we can talk about that a little later.
Yeah, happy to.
Peter also teaches metals executives in our strategic metals management program. So Peter is familiar with our industry. He teaches on a regular course of business, courses on leadership, organizational design, strategic management, within Olin's MBA, executive MBA, and the way he comes to us through the executive education program. He also teaches at the Brookings Institute, which Washington University is affiliated with. His work centers on helping organizations develop processes for innovation, assisting leaders in defining and implementing sustainably differentiating strategies, and the role of leadership and organizational values in shaping such decisions. So I think we've got the right person to talk about what we're going to talk about today, Peter. So with that, and reminding everybody to ask questions when you think of them, welcome, Peter, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Chris, for having me, and great to see you, all of you on the line. My dad is a Presbyterian pastor, and so as a result, we'd give him a really hard time for talking for an extended period of time without stopping on his sermon. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that we have some back and forth along the way. And let me give you just kind of a sense on how these things all tie together. In a lot of ways, what I want to do today is to address this question of how do we explore our future, the future of our businesses, in the midst of really tenuous and uncertain times, and outside of things tied towards COVID and the economy right now, which we'll address lightly. Also this idea that things are just picking up and being a little bit faster in terms of the cadence of change. So given that, what do we actually do? And I think that there's a couple different high-level approaches, both of which don't work. One approach is to say what we really need to do is to predict the future. So if we just know what my industry, higher education, looks like in 2025, then we can design for it. And then an alternative approach is just to assume stability. Well, this has worked for years, things will keep going back to normal, so we need to stay here. And again, I don't think either approach works in the way that it could or should. And so we're going to see if we can find some sort of way to carve a middle ground. And we're going to do so with some examples about how you might better think about your theory of strategy, as well as its implications for choices around designing your business and designing the way forward. Throughout a couple different times here, we'll talk about examples across your industry, other industries, and there will be a few different tools with links on there that you'll be able to pull out of this in case you want to take some of these ideas and go back to your own team, leadership team, et cetera, to talk it through. All right, so let me start with an industry example, two industry examples, in fact. The first one is Carvana. So I have never purchased a car with Carvana, although when I'm in the Chicago suburbs and driving on an I-88, I'm always lured in by the glowing tower on the right side or the south side of the road right there. But I found their business model especially interesting. If you take a look at Carvana, you can see a really rapid moving change in terms of their model. And in particular, they've grown like crazy. So if you think about Carvana's model, basically what they have is a massive inventory of vehicles that gets moved into this particular vending machine-like piece. And it allows you or I to be able to hop online, go to Carvana.com, and to be able to say, I want a Volkswagen fill in the blank from such and such year, and I want it delivered to my door. Pretty interesting model. So a bit ago, I was talking to a good friend of mine who was covering the industry from a financial standpoint. And in particular, he was wondering why CarMax, one of their key competitors, wasn't able to replicate everything that Carvana did. And so here's broadly what he said. This is a text message exchange. So I've never told him that I take his text message and use it in content, but I'll cite him later on. But this is what he said. He says, I'd say that the CarMax experience gets a solid B, but Carvana gets an A. And I've been disappointed that CarMax hasn't been able to replicate some of the features faster. And you can keep reading on for a few examples of what he gets to, but I want to highlight a few of them. So the question is, why haven't they been able to do this? Here's an organization sitting here in this space, looking at their future competitor, growing like gangbusters. And again, the CarMax model is more of a traditional large-scale used car lot of sorts, for lack of better words. And they know that they need to move forward in this space. They know that they need to beat with Carvana. But what prevents them from doing it? The first piece is not wanting to disrupt the core business. So yes, we want to explore that, but at the same point, we still have our bread and butter. And for many of us in organizations, we realize that this tension between the new and the existing can be somewhat problematic. Second point which he raises is this question around, we need to figure out the right model, and we're testing a bunch of different versions. And what he says is that, at least in his view from the outside, is that some of this is bureaucracy of decision-making, slowing things down. You've got someone inside your business that is committed to the way that things have been. And then the final piece of the story is some legacy or IT infrastructure that's been around forever. So in other words, we can't migrate everything to the new. We have this old approach. Imagine like your accounting system being on some old ERP and trying to make that migration over and failing to do so as quickly as you could if you ended up having a new system involved. So here's what he says. 2 years after he sat down with their leadership team and said, will you beat Carvana? And they say, yes, we will. 2 years later, they're sitting there saying, we have an online portal, call it up, and we'll tell you where our inventory is. So here's an example of an organization that sees the future, at least sees what the competitor is doing, and has a hard time replicating it. Let me change industries for a bit, and I'm going to go into the space around food. It's lunchtime after all, so we might as well talk a little bit of food. Wish I was there with you in person having some sort of meal. But this is a picture of one of Danny Meyer's restaurants. So Danny Meyer is most well known for Shake Shack, but before he did Shake Shack, he had and still has a series of fine dining establishments in New York City. This is one of their places, beautiful experience that you walk into and have this great meal. In 2015, Danny and their group came up with this new model. And they said, what we want to do is no more tipping in our restaurants. And Danny had a bunch of reasons for that. In fact, we can talk about the challenges of tipping if we want to in the Q&A. But one of the challenges in this space, for example, is the fact that there is inherent bias in who we tip more or less. And tipping's great because it's pay for performance, but who's determining performance? It's not the manager, but it's the customer. And if the customer, for example, had a cold fish and they end up tipping less because of it. Here's the waiter getting less compensation for things outside of his or her control. So Danny basically says, 2015, we are taking away tipping, no more tipping at our restaurants, and rolled out what they call hospitality included. So I started working with Danny this fall, 2019, and into the spring of 2020, and they really wanted to finally assess the data. So they actually, unlike Carvana, moved forward to a new space, launched this new model, but they'd never really taken a look inside what was going on underneath the hood of the restaurants. And so we did that. And one of the things that we found was that, in fact, they had a turnover, an increased amount of turnover of their front of the house wait staff. So Chris, I'm going to put you in the spot right here. Why do you think that they were losing some of those front of the house wait staff? You thought you were going to be asking me questions, but I'm quizzing you.
My guess is, having as a teenager worked in restaurants for tips, right? Yeah. They lost a significant percentage of their income, but the paper for performance was better for some and worse for others.
Great, spot on. So basically in pay for performance, you had this wide spread. And what you ended up having was these really talented, high-performing staff that's living in New York, where it's incredibly expensive, saying, I'm actually losing 5-7% of my income in a given week. And I love the idea, Danny, but at the same point, I have to pay my rent. So what do I do moving forward? I leave. So you had a lot of people who essentially left the restaurants. What was also interesting in conversations with Danny, and this is an upcoming Harvard Business case that we'll have this fall, what came up in conversations with Danny was that you also had a lot of people that stayed. And in fact, they stayed and they grumbled. So in other words, they weren't the high performing people, but now they're upset that they're the most senior people who used to got to choose the best shifts. Now, no longer they can do that, but they're going to stay and complain about where the organization has gone. So here's an organization moving forward, and a bunch of data starts to emerge around whether or not it's working. We can take a look at a few other cuts of this. So for example, in Maialino, one of their restaurants, what you ended up seeing was that people actually left in advance of the change itself. So they started talking and they heard about one of their buddies who's over at Union Square Cafe and about how their experience has been. And so in this case, in December of 2015, when it was announced, people said, I'm out of here. They lost 40% of their staff at that time. And we could dig into the revenue. Basically, what ends up happening is that people paid a little bit more on their checks, but there were less people coming in. And what's interesting about this is people were actually substituting their choices of an item. So in other words, let's imagine that I'm sitting with Chris and we're having a meal. And I look at the menu and I see this really expensive bottle of wine. And in fact, it seems even more expensive than the last time I've had it. Maybe it feels 20% more expensive than the last time I've had it. And so what I end up doing is I end up kind of substituting down. I don't want to leave Chris with this massive bill, I don't think. So I substitute down that bill and then end up basically at the end saying, wow, this was less expensive than I thought it was going to be, but nonetheless spent less than they would have otherwise. People are doing this mental calculation of getting the chicken instead of the steak because the steak seems really expensive. And so as a result, just a couple months ago, Danny, when looking at this business, says we are trying to understand the future of restaurants. Future of restaurants is in tumult, by the way, right? 40 to 45% of restaurants say they might go out of business in the next 6 months if they don't have further aid. Danny looks at this and says, we have to be open to everything. A bunch of people inside his organization says, we need to reconsider this hospitality strategy, and eventually moves forward to this new approach, which in a lot of ways, we're going to have to test to see if this works. Now, I bring up these two examples, and I'll pause here for a second. But I bring up these two examples because in a lot of ways, what I want to be able to speak to today with you all is the importance of not predicting the future. Danny would not know, for example, how customers are going to react to their approach. They can collect some data, they can look at it, they can do some research at the front end, but you can't fully predict. Carvana wouldn't be able to, or even CarMax, wouldn't be able to look forward and say, electrification of vehicles, that's really going to take off in the next little bit. Or people aren't going to be driving much in 2020, so maybe purchasing is going to be down. Those things are really difficult to predict. And if anyone tells you that they can predict the future, I would take a massive grain of salt before I believe them. But what we can do is to start to think about coming up with more comprehensive or articulate strategic theories, which I'll introduce in a second, as well as have robust ways to start to test our assumptions. So ideally with Danny, he was collecting data along the way to be able to start to say, how do our servers actually experience this particular thing? How do our customers adjust their behavior? And therefore, in the midst of not being able to predict the future, find ways to more agilely move across this environment to create further value. So let me pause there for a second, Chris, and see if there's any questions from you or from the attendees about these examples, or maybe its implications for how you all are thinking about your business.
We don't have any questions from the audience yet, but I do want to ask you about the typical conception of how innovation works in companies. Because if you'd have asked me before, not so long ago, I would have said, well, you have to be able to figure out what's going to happen and try to match that. So you're trying to hit a target. You're saying something entirely different. What you're saying is innovation is a bunch of small steps that you have to figure out whether they work or not, right?
Yes, I think that's right. In fact, I would identify a couple different pathways. So that's a really good distinction, Chris. So sometimes we do know in general where something is going. We have further confidence that a particular sector is going to be squeezed, and therefore we realize we need to have operational innovation to reduce our costs, for example. But a lot of times the most disruptive forms of innovation are actually not as easy to anticipate or plan. They have to be structured into processes of the organization. So let me give you just a brief example of this. There's a guy, Nick Bloom, who's an economist at Stanford, and he studies work from home. So amongst other things, he studies work from home. So things that we're doing right now. And Nick's argument is that right now, productivity for many of you, for many of us, if you are working from home, I know many people aren't, but if you are still working from home, productivity is actually up. So in other words, I don't have to commute. I'm able to take this call from an extra bedroom around the way. I might take a little break to ride a Peloton. Chris and I were just talking about biking. I might take a Peloton break and therefore have more energy in the afternoon. So my productivity short run might be up. But what Nick is arguing is that sometimes the long run productivity is actually shaped by innovation. So in other words, if we're trying to understand for your businesses what drives the future, it's these long-term innovation pieces. And in fact, long-term innovation is oftentimes spurred on by happenstance conversations. So Chris and I can hop on a call. We can get together, have a structured hour-long session, and say, we're going to talk about this particular project. But if I don't bump into you, Chris, in other ways along the way, I might actually lose the idea of maybe we should redesign the metals program in this way or that way. We're a little bit too linear. So as a result, yes, there are certain times where innovation is predict the future, design for that, and move in that direction. But in other ways, when the future is more uncertain, a big part of what we need to do is to essentially test, trial, and iterate more rapidly than some of our competitors, and do so in ways that are still low cost enough that it's not inefficient.
So there is a question from the audience, and you're going to have to decide, Peter, whether you want to answer it now or later.
Shut it down. Shut it down.
If you want me to. But it's I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but a lot of companies, they're either not big enough, or for whatever reason can't engage in what I might call risky behavior and risk the entire company on innovating. And so how do you deal with that? What are some ways that you can innovate without compromising your entire P&L?
Yeah, really spot on. So let me see if I can answer pieces of it now, and then we'll come back to that same question a bit later on, because that's going to have implications for design. So one piece of the story would be that those two mechanisms, one, we're too small, or second, we don't have the norms or culture by which we innovate. I actually feel like the second is most critical. So if size was the issue, there would be no startups. Startups are small by definition, right? One or two people trying out something new. Right. Startups, unless they're venture funded, tend to be resource light, resource poor. And in fact, if we look at the innovation literature, Clay Christensen has some good stuff on this. He basically shows that large organizations have a hard time beating small organizations, at innovation, especially disruptive innovation, not because they have limited resources, but because they don't have the culture and structures and processes in order to be nimble. In other words, going back to Carvana versus CarMax, in that space, Carvana was the upstart. A couple guys in a garage, for lack of a better word, that say, we want to redesign this particular space. CarMax, on the other hand, saw that, knew it, but it was some of these bureaucratic structures that are in place. And so a big part of what I want to think about here is what can we do to enable the kind of experimentation, skunk work kind of model that's needed to innovate in our space while not breaking the bank in doing so. And so we'll come up with a couple different tools, tricks, tips to be able to approach that in a short little bit later on in the presentation.
So is that a good segue?
You know, let's do it. We got some good questions coming in, so we might as well make sure that we get through the theory itself.
Okay.
All right, so I'm gonna put on my professor hat, and I promise you this won't be too boring over the next little bit, but I wanna be a theory person here. And in particular, I wanna acknowledge the fact that good innovation often requires having a good theory about how the world is working. So what do I mean by that? A number of years ago, 1950s, Disney in particular was starting to identify how they saw the world working. And at that point, they were in the film business. So in other words, we do this stuff in the middle, this creative talent or studio around theatrical films, putting out products in this regard. But they started to kind of think back and to say, what is our core advantage in this marketplace? And as they started to do that, they realized that it wasn't just about one piece. It was in fact about the fact that those films were linked to television shows or to music or to the 16 millimeter film, or to even the merchandising. And then eventually this vision around parks. Maybe people actually want to go to parks right now, which is ironic because right now Disney is laying off a bunch of workers in the midst of their own parks. But regardless, there is this kind of theory that started to emerge about their particular space. And my colleague Todd Zenger, who's at the University of Utah, essentially says that good businesses, good innovative businesses have to have a core theory about how they compete in this space. And so I'm not going to go into the traditional way that people talk about strategy with Porter's 5 forces and the like. But what I want to do instead is to take Todd's model here and to walk through what this means for him and what it might mean for you all as well. So here's Todd's argument. To some degree, he says good theory is about 3 different sites. The first site he calls foresight, which is beliefs you might have about where your market is evolving. So I, for example, live in the space of education. I have to have certain evolving beliefs about what people are going to want and desire in the future of education. Are they going to want this kind of stuff like here, learning from home, not just working from home? Or do they want the unique classroom environment? Those are beliefs about where the industry is evolving and what customers actually want. Second, I have to understand what I can do uniquely in that space. So Washington University is not a software business. We are a university campus. We have a beautiful campus right in the center of St. Louis. And so as a result, those resources, those assets, those capability, those faculty are part of how we might need to compete. And Todd calls that insight. What do you have that allows you to compete in this space? And then the final piece is saying, forget about what you have. Consider as well what you might be able to build in. And Todd refers to this as cross-site. So in other words, do we need to go out and acquire a new ed tech company? Do we go out and build our own digital software? So in fact, at WashU in particular, we spent a lot of times creating a center for digital learning inside our university versus a lot of our competitor institutions that have done that in an outsourced way. And as a result, it's helped us find a way to navigate this space well. So if there's one kind of core takeaway, and there will be more than one, but if there was one, I would say for you all, I think I would try to articulate, what do you think is happening in the marketplace? What do you have right now, insight, that allows you to compete effectively in that evolving space? Not now, but let's say 12 months from now, 24 months from now, 36 months from now. And do you need to make or build, acquire certain assets and capabilities that allow you to compete in this space moving forward? This idea of cross-site. So let me start with the idea of foresight just to get us started with this conversation. So who you have right there is Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel wrote a book a number of years ago on innovation that I found helpful called 0 to 1. And one of the topics that he raised at the very front end is that you have to have contrarian beliefs about the marketplace. So in other words, he frames this in a nice, concise way. He says, what is it that you believe about your industry that no one else agrees with you on? What do you believe about your sector that people think you are crazy for? Now, in a lot of ways, crazy beliefs are wrong. They're more likely to be wrong than established beliefs. But at the same point, you can imagine a couple guys at Carvana saying, we actually need to create these vending machine-like structures in the middle of the space, and people want to order a car on their phone. That's what people really want. And you can imagine those people inside CarMax saying, no. People want to go to the site. They want to kick the tires. They want to be able to engage in that space moving forward. So this is a really difficult question to answer, but I would encourage you to say, what do you believe about your industry that people don't agree with you on? Because those things are going to raise a few questions. First, are you right? Danny had a belief. Danny had a belief about his industry, which is saying, we think that there is inequity and unfairness in the tipping world. He is right about that. In fact, there still is that, which is why he's advocating for policy changes. But at the same point, he thought that all wait staff would be committed to this particular change, even at the loss of 5 to 7% of their salary. What he found out there was some were, but there were other people that said, I'd love to do this, Danny, but you know what? I have rents to pay. I've got an electricity bill here, and New York is too expensive for me to figure that out. So he had a contrarian view, but he had to go out and test it, and then eventually say, how can we uniquely respond? So initially it was with hospitality included, and right now they're starting to say, how do we address those same issues through a slightly different mechanism in place? And my guess is there's probably going to have to be a case written about USHG, their restaurant, 5 years from now, because they're going to try something new, test, experiment, and see what actually occurs. Now, I'm going to go through these just briefly, and then maybe I'll pause for a second, an in-between break here, Chris, to see if there's any clarifying questions or the like. But this is the model. So Todd is one of the authors, Todd Zanger. Another guy who I've worked with a little bit is Teppo Felin, F-E-L-I-N, who's at Oxford. And they basically did a study a number of years ago when they forced people to create a map like this. So in other words, what do you believe? What's common about your industry? What's contrarian? And then eventually, what does this imply about how you design your operation? So let me go through an example with Airbnb just to be able to fill out what this could look like. And I'll make sure that you have a link in case you want to try it from home. But here we are in regards to Airbnb. So what did they believe about the industry? Some of the things were very common and established. In other words, there's consolidation in the hotel space, right? Marriott's getting bigger, going out there and acquiring other businesses in the last little bit. At the same point, they had some uncommon beliefs, like the fact that people might be comfortable staying in someone else's home, having a unique experience versus the more sterile experience of being in a hotel. And what's crazy to me about this particular story is I would have thought this is crazy too. If I were in the hotel industry, I would say people are not going to feel comfortable staying elsewhere. But just the other day, my wife and I were trying to dream about the future of travel. And we were looking at a couple hotels to stay and a couple Airbnbs to stay. And it did feel sterile looking at a hotel. We almost were more interested in the place in the mountains, essentially in someone's home, nicely designed, than we were staying at the Radisson Blu or something. So you have some beliefs, you have some contrarian beliefs, all of which imply a certain problem by which you see the world. So for them, they said, can we broker safe, easy, and reliable access to the hotel capacity that exists in this world? All of those things are going to have implications for different sub-problems, different things they might need to test along the way. And then eventually some sort of theory at the core saying, if we do this, then we will end up having this sort of outcome. So this is an example in the context of another organization. But in fact, if you find this interesting, what I'm going to make sure is available for you, I'll give you the link in a second, is a tool that you might use amongst your team. So in other words, you might ask yourself, what's changing about our industry, or what technologies are emerging that might disrupt us moving forward? All the stuff on the top is the trends and foresight. But then down below, to ask your group, to ask your partners in your work itself, whether a small organization or large one, what do we believe about this space that our competitors and maybe even our partners think is crazy? And what might that imply about a new type of problem that we might solve? So let me pause there for a second, Chris, and we'll kind of dig into pieces of this if it's helpful before going back to a couple other ways to think about this.
Yeah, I would encourage people who are listening in to ask their questions too. But one question that comes to my mind is, can you articulate a little bit more about the difference between not being able to predict the future and doing innovation in the way that we talked about in your last segment in this?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? So there is always information about where the future is evolving. I would just say our beliefs about it have to be uncertain. So in other words, there's data coming in all the time for us about higher ed. Did freshmen continue with their plans to go to college, or did they take a gap year? That's an interesting data point that if you went back 3 months ago, people were uncertain about. Turns out that most freshmen decided to go. So that's at least one data point that makes us say, maybe there is something unique about the residential experience that, at least for right now, people want inside their college experience. So that's one data point. Now, does it help me predict the future perfectly about what the future of higher ed is going to look like in 2025? No. But what it might help me do is to at least come up with theories about where it might go and how we might think about this moving forward in ways that allow us to be able to start to, again, articulate something that could be tested. And we'll talk about the testing here in a short bit as well.
So is it fair then to say that the lower left-hand box that you have on that form,
yeah,
that says contrarian or uncommon beliefs, might be the most important box on that form?
Especially if you're in a space that is likely to evolve. Because if you get to the upper left-hand side, everyone is thinking about this, right? Everyone is thinking right now, for example, in higher ed, about developing capabilities to do Zoom calls well. So everyone's spending time and resources. It's going to be hard for us to differentiate oneself. But if we start to say something different, people want to be in person for connection, but are open to online learning experiences. And the college space should be one that enables pods of learning while at the same point social experiences in the future. Well, that's a little bit more contrarian. It's a little bit more uncommon. It may be wrong, and we'll talk about ways to test those things. But if I really want to essentially win at my market, then I have to at least have either the ability to answer the top better or have a better question than others.
Okay, so it's not so much about critical thinking. It might also be, it is about critical thinking, but it might also be about stumbling on something through a somewhat more creative process.
Totally, right? And so this is the whole benefit of pulling in outsiders to our industry. Danny Kahneman wrote a fun little piece in Harvard Business Review a few years ago that basically said you need to have outsiders that come into your sector that allow you to see things in a different way. So in fact, this happened a little bit with USHG. They didn't pull in restaurant newbies to help lead the organization, but they pulled in people that were not in fine dining. They were at Red Lobster and Darden restaurants, larger established restaurants, that came in and said, this is crazy that you do X, Y, and Z. So the example that they gave us is that USHG had something like 35 different olive oils across their 10 different restaurants. And so Chip Wade came in and said, this is crazy. I'm not saying that you go down to one version that you only get at Costco, but what I might suggest to you is 95% of your customers can't tell the difference between 10 and 35. And I think in a lot of ways, we can get into a space, a sector where we have a hard time seeing the untested assumptions of our particular sector. And so you do that partly by bringing in novel voices, novel perspectives. You do that partly by having conversations outside of your sector. So if I only go to higher education forums and I don't spend time like I do working with companies, then I'm going to be essentially blinded towards the evolution of my space. Yeah, spot on.
It reminds me of benchmarking in a way, but what it seems like you're suggesting is make sure if you're going to benchmark, if you're going to look at common or uncommon practices, make sure your set of benchmarks is broad, not narrow.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, right? So you can do it by virtue of your process of benchmarking, identify other industries that target different sort of metrics that you care about, see what they're actually doing, related industries, right? So if you're in the hotel space, you don't necessarily want to look at the metals space,
Right.
but there are probably related sectors of hospitality that they should be paying attention to. And I think for many of you, I would encourage the same thing. Try to identify ways to pull in talent from other sectors. And in the absence of doing so, make sure that you have a way to be able to benchmark with those things in mind.
Interesting. So it sounds like the source of that kind of talent can be numerous places, right?
Totally, totally. But I think that we too often underestimate it. If you really want to get down to the lower side of this contrarian belief, it has to be built into interaction with novel perspectives. And the best way to do that is to be systematic about building it in with people and process over time.
Okay, so you're not really winging it. You're actually, there's a process.
Totally. Yeah. So I think people too often think of creativity as a space where the artist is sitting back and they're thinking and they're eventually coming up with something new, and don't have any process there. Or it's corporate R&D, which is like, here's our budget, here's how we're going to do it, here's our target, as you mentioned earlier on. I think in a lot of ways, you can be incredibly systematic about that exploration process that we talked about.
Okay, good, interesting.
Okay. Let me go through a few more points, and Chris, hop in at any point along the way to stop us.
Okay.
So what I want to highlight here, and in fact, if you're interested in doing something like this at home, what I have there is a link, tinyurl.com/Olin-innovation. And that's going to take you to a Google Sheet. You need to make a copy of that for yourself, download it as an Excel file and the like. But if you want to try this out at home, not just have me talk about it in the context of other industries, go to that site, pull it up, and then essentially find ways to play around with it, come up with ideas, test it with other people that are inside of your business. So 2 points to this. We might skip through a few slides here, but one point is to say you need to build this good theory. But I want to highlight the second point, which is important, which is you need to learn ways to test that theory as well. So going back to Chris's point, on the one hand, it's not merely about predicting the future, because anyone that's predicting the future, you have to not fully trust. A futurist, for example, I never trust someone who calls themselves a professional futurist. But nonetheless, it's not winging it. It has to be somewhat systematic. And I would encourage you to be systematic in how you test some of these things as well. And so let me give you just a few recommendations. We'll go through a few examples on testing, and then we'll end with some ideas around design. So on the testing side, there's a book that came out about a year ago by Stefan Tomke. If you want the shortened version because you live busy professional lives, take his last name and Google that coupled with HBR. And he has a shortened article that's about a 10-minute read that gives you some ideas around how experimentation can be run inside your business. So THOMKE, HBR will give you some of those links. So here's my idea here. You come up with these theories, you come up with these ideas. The question is, can you start to test them? And I'm going to give you essentially 3 different ways to think about it. One by one, we'll go through examples, and then I see that there's even some other questions coming in, which we can hop into in a break. So the first piece is to say, can you test the validity of an idea before you even implement something? So one of the lessons that has come out of the folks out of Silicon Valley when it comes to innovation is this idea of a pre-mortem analysis. So pre-mortem analysis is the opposite of a post-mortem. Post-mortem means you've got a body lying on the table and you're trying to determine the cause of death. Pre-mortem basically says, we're thinking about doing something new. Let's come up with all the potential reasons that it might fail. Now, the reason why pre-mortem is especially helpful is oftentimes with innovation, there are ideas around what the problem behind a given initiative are, but there's not necessarily the safe space and conversation whereby which people can raise those points. So in the case of hospitality included, you can bet there were a bunch of people saying, I think there's going to be high turnover. I think the wait staff is going to leave. I'm not sure the customer is going to be able to adjust their perception of things. But they may have looked at someone that they really deeply admire, Danny Meyer, an icon of the restaurant business, and say, I'm not sure I can bring this up right now. And so one of the things I would encourage most of you to do when it comes to innovation is if you're rolling out a new space, a new initiative, bring up this method of a pre-mortem analysis. In other words, a short meeting where you say, before we get started in this direction, I want everyone to identify 2 to 3 reasons why this is going to fail. And though that can seem kind of dark, like a postmortem in some ways, the benefit of this is you start to be able to see the germs of things that you can start to test. If someone had said there, I think there's going to be turnover in terms of the staff, well, then you go and you interview your staff. You find out. That's one example. Second is the idea of testing something with greater precision. So can you roll it out across a certain market, but not another, and really start to see what actually works? And then the third is a little bit related, which basically says sometimes it works in certain sectors and not in others, and you really need to be precise about targeting. Imagine an innovation that works well with one customer group, but not with the other. The issue is not doing that innovation, but it's making sure you find fits between the product and the particular market you care about. So let me give you just a few quick examples of that, and then we'll go back, Chris, to you and to some other questions that are coming in. And I do encourage you to bring up questions because we can hop into any of those things that might be related to your work.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first idea is basically saying after postmortem, right? So pre-mortem we already talked about. This idea of experimentation basically says the true test of something is a randomized controlled trial. So this is where science can really help us out here. It basically says in a true test of any sort of intervention, what you're doing is you're randomizing who receives it and then giving half of them your answer and the other half you don't give them to it at all. And you test the outcomes. So we think of this in terms of medicine. I do some work in the healthcare sector. If they could do not a drug trial, because that can be somewhat complicated if you really think that there is some efficacy of what you're testing. But imagine it's just encouraging people to take their medication in different ways when they come home. And half of the population has an app that reminds them daily about their medication needs. And the other half just gets an email reminder once. Well, the question is, can I run this in a pure randomized fashion and see whether or not there's any sort of difference in the outcomes of interest that I care about? In certain digital environments, so booking.com is a good example of this. If you're interacting with your customers, for example, in some sort of online version, what you can also run is what's called a holdout test, which basically says we're pretty confident that this works. We're pretty confident that this is the best way to interact with our customers in a mailing campaign, for example, but we still want to run it with 5% held back because there's still benefits of finding out if there's a difference between the 95 and 5. So this seems really simple in a lot of ways, but so many organizations do not do this in their practice. And as a result, kind of fly blind in regards to what they think they're doing in practice. Let me go beyond this to give you an example of what this looks like in the context of USHG. So USHG has a bunch of different restaurants. There's 8 of them there right now. Myalino, Blue Smoke, Union Square Cafe, etc. What they could do if trying to roll something like this out would be first to identify a couple to test at the front end. Let's run it at Union Square Cafe. Let's run it at Blue Smoke. Let's see what those outcomes might be and really test for all the things that might have come up in that pre-mortem analysis. And then eventually determine that maybe it works in certain types of restaurants and not others. So perhaps, for example, it works really well in Jazz Standard because Jazz Standard is a bar. And as a result, when people are making choices around purchasing, they're not thinking of prices for their gin and tonic. But it doesn't work as well at Union Square Cafe with their really large lunch crowd because people are more conscious around lunch purchases, perhaps because they haven't been sitting at the bar. So as a result, what I'm kind of doing here is starting to say, can I do some tests first? And then follow up by saying, can I discern what actually works about the solution and build it in? And ideally, what I'm doing there is I'm paying attention to some shorter term metrics. I might want to know if I lose wait staff at the front end, or what happens to profit, or in this case, what happened to the gap between the front of the house pay and the back of the house pay, the line staff versus the wait staff, for example. But I'm probably also going to pay attention to some things longer term. So in other words, one point here that I'll highlight that's a different metric is server shift. So one of the unintended consequences they found in regards to rolling this out at USHG is they had some really talented staff that no longer was taking their Friday night shift. And if you've worked in a restaurant before, you know that Fridays are busy, they're high stress, you are essentially not enjoying yourself and you're giving up a Friday night. But you do that because why? Bigger tips. And so all of a sudden, if I don't get that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my shifts on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I'm going to keep my weekend free. Maybe I'll go out to outside of the city, or I'll take up a side gig, side hustle. But an unintended consequence of this is your best wait staff started to do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then all of a sudden, Friday nights, when all your high paying guests come in, they've got a green staff right in front of them. Someone who just got onboarded a couple months ago, because that's the only slot left. And so the way to test things in a lot of ways is very simple. See if you can either pre-mortem analysis it, come up with ideas why it might fail. See if you can come up with ways to test an intervention. Easier said than done when it comes to online, harder for in-person, but not by any means impossible. And then most importantly, can you make sure that you're focusing in on intended metrics like the first one, profits, but also some unintended metrics that you might want to zero in on that start to pop in different ways over time. So let me pause there and Chris, see if there's any questions that we have either from you or from the audience. And then I'll go through the last section too in a bit, which is around design.
Okay, so we do have a question, and it has to do with what the questioner is calling near adjacencies and far adjacencies.
It's a good framing.
And this goes
I might
back
steal
to,
that. I'm going to steal that framing.
Okay, good. We all learn something on these webinars. This goes back to the critical systematic thinking about what you might do that's different, yep. Right? And how far do you want to deviate from your current core business model? Can you go too far?
Yeah. So in fact, we're going to address a piece of that in our last section, but let me give you again a small preview. And I like your framing around near versus far adjacency. So near adjacency, what's going to happen in the next 6 months for our business, right? There's some interesting questions about what happens in summer 2021 for higher ed. If you're in the restaurant business, there's a question of what happens when you move from 50% occupancy back to 100%. Will people that have gotten really used to buying groceries now be so excited that they want to come back into restaurants, or they have picked up a new hobby and therefore don't need to go back to a restaurant? So the near adjacency stuff, and this goes to Chris's point, is stuff that you can kind of target and design for. In other words, we're 85% certain that there's going to be a different uptick in demand for how undergrads think about higher ed next year. So that's almost a need to have. You need to have people working on those particular issues. The far adjacency, it's really a question around whether or not you do it internal or external to the house. So in other words, if you don't want to be fully disrupted and your industry is going to be disrupted, you have to do some of it. The question is how you do it. So one approach is to say you build it internally. You invest in R&D. You ramp up your spending. You get a team of dedicated people in a skunk works working on something. Alternatively, what you do is you let the market figure it out. So in pharma, for example, over the last several years, pharmaceutical groups like Johnson & Johnson used to have massive R&D budgets. And they pulled those things back and instead ramped up their M&A budgets. So in other words, we're not going to do this in-house as much. We're going to let the market figure it out. And then eventually at the very tail end, go out and buy or acquire that sort of innovation. So near adjacency far, I think you have to do near. On the far side, you want to make sure that it doesn't take too much time or is too happenstance. It should be tested. And eventually it should be a theory about whether or not we do this in-house or whether or not we eventually go out and acquire something new because we want the market to determine what actually works or not. It's a great question. A tough one, but a great question.
Yeah, I have another one that you might call tough. I don't know. Talent and human resources. And how do companies find people internally or externally who are willing to engage in this kind of activity? Because it's typical to be risk averse with a business, right?
Yep.
Not want to go too far.
Yep.
And yet going too far in some smaller way might be exactly what you need to do.
Yep. Yeah, so it's a great question. Let me give you a brief example of this. So I think one of the things that you have to acknowledge the fact is that there are some people that love this sort of work. They love thinking about white landscape and coming up with a new path moving forward. And if they love it and they're talented at it, to craft some portion of their time for doing that can be really beneficial. Can be beneficial for retaining talent, because if I feel like I'm just caught in the weeds doing day-to-day administration, but I'm given 10% of my time or 5% of my time to be able to work on some big picture projects, that might actually engage young talent in a new way moving forward. At the same point, you don't want to acknowledge that this is something that everyone wants to do. In fact, one of the things that Google learned over the last little bit when they first experimented with giving people time to work on the future of their business, they gave basically people famously 20% of their time as engineers to work on new things like Google Maps. What they found is that some people hated it. And so they ended up having to go back to an approach where we want to give some people even more of that time. Some people give them 50% of their time to only work on this. And then a lot of people pull it back to zero. So one way to do it at a simple level is to actually kind of scan the landscape of HR, say, are there people that are uniquely talented at this and or interested in this that we might be able to give them some time to work on those ideas?
Interesting. So asking for volunteers might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, volunteers might not get you at talent. So it's possible that I'll raise my hand and say, I love this. But it might not get at actually whether I'm good at it, but it will get at the fact of, are they engaged by this kind of work? And if employee retention is one piece of what you want to improve on, that's a way to think about it.
Okay, well, with 10 minutes left, I don't want to miss the last section.
Oh yeah, okay. So let me give you a few final framings, and I'm gonna do this pretty quick and then we'll stop for some questions at the very tail end. This gets at a little bit of a question of what was addressed earlier, which is how do you make sure you pursue innovation without essentially breaking the bank or destroying your P&L? And so I'm gonna give you essentially four options, 4 routes, and then we'll pause to see if there's any questions. First model, and again, I'll do it quick, but first model is saying you have a business and that business functions by virtue of fit. So for example, I did some work a number of years ago with an automotive bumper company, and they were really in the steel space. And by virtue of that steel bumper space, they had different sort of suppliers, different sort of buyers. They worked with different people, different OEMs than they would have if they were in the aluminum space. They were more embedded in the US market where weight requirements were less stringent and less in the European market. But then slowly over time, there was a movement from steel to aluminum. And as they did that, one of the things they had to do was to say, can we kind of optimize our model? So can we take a few things in this broader system? This comes from a model called McKinsey 7S. Can we take this and just tweak some way of our staffing, hire a few new people? Or maybe just our strategy a little bit, more heavily move into the European market. But what we're talking about here is not a massive change over, but small adjustments that ideally can also be tested along the way. Sometimes the model that you're dealing with is small enough of a change that it can be optimized. In higher ed right now, we rightly or wrongly believe that this is an optimized model. Let's not rethink all of higher ed. Let's make sure we deliver the same stuff with some small tweaks. Second model is a little bit different. It says, keep your existing business, but at the same point, separate out something new. So this is actually what that automotive group did. They said, we need to stay plain in steel because steel is where we make our money. But at the same point, we need to get this group that's really focused on understanding the aluminum market. They've done this now a couple times as they moved into plastics and other sorts of materials. So on the plastic side, there's this question of actually having to manufacture different types of parts all together, right? Steel to aluminum is some ways easier than steel to plastic, at least for this organization. So they were able to craft what they would call a dual structure. Let's make something small, let's give it autonomy, and let's have them run with it moving forward. And you can do this in-house, as we've already talked about it, or you can do this through acquisition. So I'm working with a private equity group right now that's spending some time thinking about this. They're working with a metals-related group as well, trying to decide whether or not they go into a different sort of fastener. And the question is whether or not they stay by doing this in-house, let's do it through R&D, or in their case, looking at doing it through acquisition instead. Option 3, and then option 4, and then I'm done. 3 and 4, and I'm done. Third is basically saying you think that there is a need to really radically transform your business. So this is like higher ed completely flips, and all classes are one faculty and 2,000 students alongside mentorship dynamics along the way. If that is the case, going for an incremental change or even a dual structure is actually almost the most risky thing you can do. And this is a little bit of what CarMax was doing. So we'll keep with our legacy business, but let's experiment over here. If CarMax's business really does radically transform, the key thing is saying we need to make a single bet and go all in. And it might require different forms of engaging with our customer. It might require new staff altogether, a single bet to transform across the organization. Those things are tricky. That's a whole lecture in and of itself, but it's worth thinking about. If you're in a sector that is transforming enough that you can't do small bets, you have to do something big. The challenge here, Chris, and I'll make my last point or two, but the challenge here is that basically you make the wrong bet. And so Ford, in the last little bit, Jim Hackett, who is no longer at Ford, said in, I think it was January of this year, whenever that date is, last spring, basically said, we overestimated self-driving cars. We thought that this was the future. We moved a ton of stuff over there, kind of in a dual structure, right? Ford was still doing pickups, but creating this separate environment. And we think that it's still going to be where the future is heading, but we think it's more like 3 to 5 years downstream. And so if this is a risk, the last approach you can do is basically saying you want to do a portfolio of bets. So if you're Ford, for example, and you're uncertain about where automotive is going, you need to create multiple different skunk works, multiple different approaches, a little in autonomous, a little in connectivity, a little in smart mobility, et cetera. The risk on this is all of those bets are somewhat expensive. So you're trying to find out the minimal number of bets that you can try in very lean startup sort of ways that allows you to explore this market. And you see an example of Ford at the top, but Johnson & Johnson, an organization that I've done a little bit of work with over the last little bit, is another example that they basically says, let's not do it in-house. Let's ramp down our R&D, but let's instead partner with other groups that might be doing this experimentation already. So they've created really tight linkages and partnerships with universities where they're saying the university labs are doing cool stuff around CRISPR that we don't want to do in-house, but we think might be the future of certain parts of pharma. So let's work closely with them. Let's make sure we have people hired from the university that have their finger on the pulse. And eventually at some point you might say, let's go all in with one particular direction. So my final point here, and then Chris, I'm curious if you had a good closing comment or two. But my final point is to say, when it comes to doing innovation well, it can't merely be about identifying the future and building for it. It has to have some level of experimentation, theory that drives that experimentation, and eventually structural choices that you're making inside your business that allow you to push in the direction of an uncertain, uncommon future that all of us are dealing with right now.
Can we put that in a metals industry context for a second?
Yeah, of course.
All right. So one of the things I think that is on people's minds in the metals distribution business is Amazon.
Yep.
I mean, Amazon's got this enormous infrastructure.
Yep.
And a lot of money and a willingness to enter into any market they want to enter into.
Yep.
Let's say that Amazon, as they have, decides to sell metal. If you were an executive of a metals distribution company, how would you start to think about dealing with that inside of the process that you've just articulated?
Yeah, so it's a great point. So the question is, if Amazon comes in, is there a way that I can beat Amazon? And the wrong way would be trying to beat Amazon in Amazon's game. So Amazon is going to be really good at having an already established set of customers that essentially have a really wide distribution network. And so, for example, if I'm trying to beat Amazon at speed or convenience, it's going to be difficult to do that. Now, that said, Amazon is really good at certain types of customer relationships. They're good at selling to myself, my wife, you, your families. They're not as good at distributing to more of the B2B space. they may not have the same kind of cycles of engaging and understanding the needs and customizing a purchase there. And so one way to approach this is to say, we want to find out what our core distinct advantages relative to Amazon. What's the part of our, again, insight or cross-site that is difficult for them to replicate, at least the front end. And then starting to think about how I might acquire other capabilities to move in this direction. So this actually happened a little bit with those in the pharma space as well as medical space. There's a lot of fear if you're a pharmacy about Amazon doing the exact same thing.
Right.
In fact, them purchasing Whole Foods is really a movement in this direction because they now have brick and mortar shop where they can distribute from. And so as a result, you saw not a bunch of internal R&D, but a lot of M&A plays that occurred in this space. So groups like Cigna went out and purchased Express Scripts, a PBM. Other sorts of mergers happened between smaller pharmacy groups that wanted to get big enough to have some level of core capacity to compete. So I think at a high level, what I would say is it's difficult for any of us to compete with Amazon, but we have to find ways to do so because Bezos has indicated that he's going after many different markets.
He's going to do what he's going to do.
So you've got to find essentially some sort of way to say, is our unique advantage in the way that we have relationships with who we're selling to in a B2B context and the way that we customize our offering so that they're willing to actually stay with us despite the fact that it might be a little bit more convenient to go elsewhere. If that is your in, then you try to find a way to make it as customized a fit as possible to prevent the ability to be beaten out in that regard.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate, I kind of put you on the spot there for a minute.
No, I loved it. I loved it. I got to be a metals executive for a day. It was fun.
To do that. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to have to stop, but I don't really want to, but I'm going to have to. So Peter, thank you. As always, good to see you again. Hopefully the next time I see you, it'll be in person in St. Louis.
I hope so as well. I look forward to that. And if you have any follow-up questions, I've got my email on there. I've got a newsletter that I write about a lot of these issues. So if you find this interesting to follow on, or obviously reach out to me on LinkedIn. But Chris, always
the PDF version of your slides.
I will get it to you. Yep, I will get it to you.
Yeah, I already have it. You actually did.
Oh, do I want to send it to you?
I'm good to go. Yeah.
Yeah. How do I send it to this group? Do I send it in the chat or do
you
I?
You send it to me and I'll forward it to them. So
great.
No problem. Yeah.
We'll make sure you all have it. And again, reach out if you got any questions. It's been great to be with you today.
Okay. So, folks, thank you for being on this webinar. I hope that you learned from it. When Peter's involved, you generally will. It's true of all the faculty at the Olin Business School. When you leave this webinar, you're going to be presented with a pop-up window that asks you to complete a post-webinar survey. I would ask that you please do that. That helps us get better at doing these webinars. Please suggest topics that you'd like to hear us have presented, whether it's Peter or someone else. We really want to know what you'd like to hear about because we're doing a lot of these. They will continue to be free. So please let us know and rate your experience. On behalf of Dr. Boumgarden, Peter, thank you for doing this again. And the Olin Business School at Washington University and MSCI, thanks for participating today. Have a safe day and stay well, and goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Peter.